All right, we've got some breaking news relative to that hearing in New York. You're seeing the protesters here behind me. They would like the release of former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. That did not happen inside a New York courtroom. So let's go to CBS News correspondent Lilia Luciano. She is outside that courthouse. So you were there. You saw the players. What did you see?
Well, first of all, Reed, let's be very objective about what happened, what we saw. We saw Maduro noticeably thinner, looked pretty healthy, if you ask me. Also, his wife, who her defense team said she was dealing with some cardiac issues, they looked pretty healthy to me personally. They walked in wearing khaki overcoats, and he had that orange jumpsuit underneath. Importantly, he did not speak this time. Last time, Maduro claimed that he's an innocent man, that he's a decent man, that he's a prisoner of war. This time, neither Maduro nor Cilia Flores, his wife, said anything at all during the hearing. Except when they greeted their defense attorneys, he said saludos, thanked them. Throughout the hearing, though, very important contradictions came up. The main thing that was discussed is who will pay the bill, who will carry the bill for Maduro and Cilia's defense. And what Maduro and Cilia say is, we don't have any personal funds. Of course, there are many questions about that, and the prosecutors challenge that notion, but that's something that might come up in the future. So what they want is for the people of Venezuela. Venezuelan taxpayers are supposed to carry the bill. The biggest issue is that the government of Venezuela is still sanctioned under the United States. So the defense is trying to say, look, the government of Venezuela is willing to pay. The prosecutors are saying, well, those funds are tainted. Those funds are illegal. That country is sanctioned. But the most interesting moment to me was the contradictions that came up, because the judge himself asked, well, aren't we in business with that government? At one point, it was brought up that since the removal of Maduro, since Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, was brought to power, Venezuela has made more than $18 billion in oil. So there's a question, why not use those funds if they're not, quote unquote, tainted? This is a complicated case that's going to take a long time. And the biggest question here is it going to be U.S. taxpayers, a public defender's office that's going to carry this extensive and expensive defense? Or is it going to be the Venezuelan taxpayers who, and this is important, the only reason why the Venezuelan government would carry that bill and the Venezuelan taxpayers would pay that bill is because Maduro refused to step down when he lost the election in 2024. The U.S. considers him an illegitimate president. The person who succeeded him, the U.S. considered, up until recently, an illegitimate vice president. So now, even though 70% of Venezuelans voted him out of power, now they have to pay, depending on what happens in the coming weeks and months and what the court decides. They are faced with the possibility of having to pay for his defense for a case where he is charged with trafficking, with drug trafficking, with narcotic terrorism, and with corruption. So it's just a really interesting thing that came up to me as I'm looking at him and hearing from so many Venezuelans, having been on the ground and hearing from the Venezuelans who have been fighting and protesting and facing backlash from those figures, that they would have to carry that bill. But the alternative at this point might be that the U.S. carries that bill. What was decided? Nothing at this point. The judge reserved the possibility of making that ruling in the near future. The other thing that was discussed was what will happen to the evidence and whether the people who are charged with the same crimes as Maduro, who are still part of his case, who are considered fugitives, but also are still in power in Venezuela, whether or not they get to see the evidence that they themselves are facing. That will also be decided by the judge after the prosecutors and the defense agree on exactly the wording of that order. But this is important because there's a real concern that because the regime figures in Venezuela are still in power, because people like Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister of Venezuela, is a co-defendant in this case, is still considered a fugitive by the United States, but is still in power and overseeing the entire security apparatus of Venezuela, the people who are witnesses, who gave testimony, who are part of the evidence against Maduro, could face backlash, persecution, as has happened in the past.
What a complex set of facts there. Lilia Luciano, good to check in with you. Thank you so much for stepping out of court and updating our viewers.
Thanks,
Have a
Reed.
good day.